So hi, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Barika Williams. It's great to be here with you, Dan, and with the audience. Thank you for joining us from wherever you are in this moment, and from all of our nonprofit groups, design studios, government agencies, banks, and other allies in the field, near and far. We have a really, really amazing, rich discussion planned today. We're all incredibly excited about what's our speakers and what we're going to get to talk about today for our seventh Power After the Pandemic conversation in this series. For those of you who are new to ANHD, that's the Association for Neighborhood and Housing Development. We work to build community power and win affordable housing and thriving, equitable neighborhoods for all New Yorkers. ANHD has been around for more than 45 years. We represent over 80 neighborhood-based and citywide non-for-profit organizations who develop, preserve, manage affordable housing, push for tenants' rights, are supporting our small businesses, advocating for responsible banking and investment, and working to preserve our manufacturing and industrial spaces and quality jobs. So a lot going on at this time. There are also many of them serving as hosts for vaccination sites across the city. So we're very proud of all the work that they've been doing in this pandemic. And what we at ANHD believe is that housing justice is racial justice, is economic justice. So that's how we approach this work.
Hey, Brika. Hello, New York. I'm Dan McPhee, Executive Director of the Urban Design Forum. We're an independent membership organization debating the critical issues facing our city. Our fellows are designers, developers, public officials, and advocates working to shape a better future for all New Yorkers. It's really nice to be back with you all today. When we kicked off this series last fall, we were seeking remedy to our despair. So we invited some of the brightest leaders in community development, urban design, and public policy from across the country to inspire us with their ideas. Today is no exception. We have 4 extraordinary speakers with the power and passion to act on our climate crisis. But before we launch into this afternoon's discussion, we just wanted to take a moment to congratulate so many of our members on the call who have made us more hopeful than ever about New York City. You all fought for better budgets and policy shifts that invest in New Yorkers, that keep people in their homes, that recognize the value of our immigrant communities, and that reclaim the public realm for the people. We still have a ways to go to build a truly just city, but in the meantime, we owe you our gratitude. So congratulations and keep at it.
And I want to echo Dan's congratulations we had a hard-fought budget. We're just coming out of it, but a special shout out to many of our groups, including some of the folks who are on here today, who won the first ever in the nation Fund for Excluded Workers as a part of this year's budget. So a big kudos for us getting the support to so many of our excluded workers that have been helping us get through in this time. So today we're turning to the built environment and a conversation around the built environment to discuss our basic infrastructure like housing, transit, schools, and how reinvestment in that infrastructure can be tied to the urgency of the climate crisis and the need for economic democracy and redistribution. With over 500,000 jobs lost in the past year in New York City alone, compounded with record levels of income inequality prior to the pandemic, we really have an opportunity to rebuild New York's economy in a way that prepares us for the impacts of climate change while securing economic benefits for the frontline communities. And this is really a very poignant and very timely conversation, as we're also in parallel having a federal conversation about investment in infrastructure. So we're incredibly honored to have 2 incredible speakers with us today to discuss this topic. U.S. Representative Jamaal Bowman, an educator who was elected last year to represent New York's 16th district, a district that spans parts of North Bronx and Westchester County, and Julian Brave NoiseCat, a policy advocate and activist who serves as Vice President of Policy and Strategy for Data for Progress. They'll be joined by respondents from ANHD and UDF's membership. So this is one of the things we really love doing, is bringing our membership into these conversations with some of our amazing leaders and experts across the country. And we'll be joined by Michael Partis of Bronx Cooperative Development Initiative, or BCDI, and Jainey Bavishi from New York City Mayor's Office of Resiliency. So now I'm going to bring our speakers on. So if we could get Representative Bowman and Julian, Brave NoiseCat, to turn, and I'll turn it over to Karen Afreski. So if we could get you all to turn on your cameras. Narefsky, sorry, Karen, I said that wrong.
No problem. Thanks so much, Barika and Dan. And thanks so much to our speakers. Really excited to enter this conversation with all of you. Before I turn the microphone over, I'm just gonna provide a little bit of framing of part of why we're having this discussion today. And we've got a really loud ice cream truck out on my street, so I hope that you all can't hear it, or if you can hear it, you can get some ice cream after we're done. So one of the things that all of us at ANHD and UDF are really focused on in this moment is how to deal with the fact that there has been unquestionable disinvestment in our urban infrastructure over the last half a century. We can see it in signal failures on the subway, mold in public housing apartments, schools without functioning windows. The lack of investment in urban communities is really hard to ignore. But over the last several decades in places like New York and other urban centers, as awareness of this disinvestment has grown, we've also started to see another trend, which is that reinvestment has been explicitly tied to displacement and has provided amenities and opportunities to affluent white residents, while often leaving people of color incredibly vulnerable to the economic, climate, and health crises that we now face. And this has also created a great deal of mistrust and skepticism among those communities that the universal programs we need to address them won't be truly universal. So in order to really shift that dynamic, I think the politics of recovery and reinvestment have to be politics of redistribution. And we need to avoid the failures of the 2009 stimulus, when the federal government did not invest deeply in infrastructure and public works, except for the more shovel-ready projects that were often not the most impactful for addressing social inequities. So if there's one lesson that we should learn from 2009, it's that if we're going to invest in recovery, we have to invest big. But we should also learn from the New Deal recovery efforts of the 1930s, where bold investments at the national level often were stymied by flawed agencies at the municipal level, especially when it comes to housing and land use. So we need implementation at every level to be coordinated, intentional, and impactful. But I think there's a lot of hope that the recovery of the 2020s is going to be different. For one, the political climate is different. Popular mobilizations are uplifting bold and universal solutions like the Green New Deal and a jobs guarantee, while racial justice movements are fighting to ensure that equity is a main ingredient and not an afterthought in our federal policy. In the meantime, just last week, the federal government introduced a proposal to spend over $2 trillion on equitable investments in physical infrastructure, along with investments in social infrastructure that show kind of a new understanding of how those systems really are interconnected and how they can uplift the communities that have been most hurt by the disinvestment of the last several decades. So I think the last year and what's happened with the pandemic has really shown us what happens when we're not prepared and when we fail to meet the moment as a nation and as a society. And so now we're going to talk about how to meet the moment. And we'll start with remarks from our guest presenters, followed by thoughts and responses from our ANHD and UDF respondents. So I'm really excited to start by introducing Julian Brave NoiseCat. Julian's a Vice President of Policy and Strategy at Data for Progress and the Narrative Change Director at the Natural History Museum, which is an arts and activist collective. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Guardian, and many other publications. And he's going to discuss narrative strategy to build momentum for policies like the Green New Deal and the challenges that we need to overcome to accelerate those types of public investments. So Julian, I'm happy to turn it over to you.
Wonderful, Kukshem, Karen, and thank you so much to ANHD and of course to Congressman Bowman, who I'm a huge fan of, for the invitation to speak on this panel today. I actually got my start as an NYC Urban Fellow working in the Department of Housing Preservation and Development. So speaking to ANHD and this group of folks is a special treat for me. Let's see, I'm going to try to share my screen here and we can run through some slides as the walks are wont to do. Okay, I think that that's working. All right, so as Karen said, I'm going to talk a little bit through the narrative and from a data-oriented perspective, some encouraging signs for progressives and I think folks of our ideological and policy persuasion around the American Jobs Plan and the potential for what I would say is a progressive, sustainable, and equitable approach to infrastructure and fiscal stimulus in the coming year, which is, as you can see in the big yellow block on my screen, what I would say is a once in a generation opportunity to build a more prosperous nation, a more prosperous, just, and sustainable nation. And I think that we need to, take a moment here to acknowledge the importance of the progressive movement in shaping this moment that we have entered into. The American Jobs Plan, which President Biden outlined last week, more than $2 trillion investment that would be put into the economy over 8 years to green infrastructure, create jobs, and promote racial justice, bears, I would say, many of the markings of the Green New Deal, this set of ideas around decarbonizing the economy in an equitable way that were advanced by Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Senator Ed Markey, and social movements like the Sunrise Movement. I would say that I agree with progressive critiques of the American Jobs Plan, essentially saying that it could be bigger. I would also agree with Karen's opening remarks around the failures of the Obama era stimulus, ARA, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009, that it was too small. And there is some research out there. Of course, economic models are finicky and complicated things, but there is some research out there, particularly by Bob Pollan and the Political Economy Research Institute, that suggests the United States should be investing something like $1 trillion per year or $10 trillion over 10 years to achieve full employment while meeting climate goals. So I'm going to set that aside at the beginning just to say that I think the American Jobs Plan is great, but that the ideological camp that I identify myself with, would actually like to see even more. Looking at the American Jobs Plan and our infrastructure opportunity moment, my team at Data for Progress, which I just want to say is a really incredible group of researchers and advocates. Just want to shout out our senior climate data analyst who helped me put together this slide deck, Danielle Dieserath, as well as my political director, Marcella Mulholland, who helps us get all of this data into the hands of policymakers, which is really important. Drilled down here on sort of 3 areas that I would say are core progressive priorities and pillars in an infrastructure plan. The first is, of course, jobs. So that's getting people back to work in good paying and hopefully union jobs as we recover from the pandemic. The second is justice. So ensuring that we empower communities on the front lines of poverty and pollution through this set of historic investments. And then, of course, the fight against climate change, where the federal government is going to play a leading role in helping decarbonize the economy. And our initial polling on the American Jobs Plan, which does try to tackle these 3 pillars, is quite hopeful. So this actually was, too much to my team's delight, a poll that was cited by Jen Psaki in the White House on a press briefing earlier this week. But voters across party lines actually support the American Jobs Plan. So far, as you can see, the top line support level is 73%, which is quite strong. It's nearly universal support among Democrats, of course. But we also see right now a majority of Republicans in our polling saying that they support the American Jobs Plan. Of course, it's very early on in this legislative campaign, and Republicans are now going to mount a very strong offensive against this plan, and we should expect that these numbers will not remain where they are. But we're starting at a very strong place as we try to make some real meaningful and lasting change. And when you drill down into some of the specific portions of the economy that the American Jobs Plan would invest in, so physical infrastructure, the care economy, this is the notion that we should be investing in the folks who care for the elderly and the young, who help make us healthy, et cetera. American manufacturing, clean energy, housing, et cetera. We also see strong support for all of these, with physical infrastructure leading, but I would say notably, and we're not going to get into this today, the care economy appears to test very strongly, despite the fact that just the other day, actually, Republicans suggested that the care economy was not real infrastructure. It seems that voters might not agree with that perspective. Looks like I'm a little delayed. Okay, so let's look a little deeper here at jobs, which is a popular and core element of the American Jobs Plan. It's in the name, of course. On the subject of a just transition, so this is the notion that we need to be paying special attention to the work of people who are employed in the fossil fuel industry and adjacent industries and employment in the transition to clean energy. We see here that supporting those specific workers in the transition and through an infrastructure investment is quite popular, again, across party lines, and including when you use framings around union workers, which I think is really important because there's been a decades-long effort to erode support for unions in this country. And despite that, we have seen increasingly in our data, strong support for unions and for union jobs. Similarly, this is just one policy, but there's this idea that the federal government can use its purchasing power as, probably the largest buyer in many markets in this country and in the world, to empower workers and also to purchase more green technologies. This is called Buy Clean, and it's an idea that's being pushed by unions and coalitions of unions and environmentalists. And we found that this idea also has majority support in the 60%, in the 60-ish% region, although it is not above majority support among Republicans. Looking here into the notion that we need to be advancing environmental justice through the American Jobs Plan, we also found encouraging numbers, despite, I would say, a real rise in racial resentment in this party, which has found obviously a significant vehicle among the Republican Party. So in this question, we asked voters to, we did a binary, which is where you ask your respondents to choose between two different sort of statements and say which one they agree with more. One is a sort of Democratic type statement, the other is a Republican statement. And that here, voters want the president and his party to invest in long overdue infrastructure investments. I think that there's a very broad sense that our infrastructure is disinvested in and crumbling. And that voters also want these investments to be equitable and sustainable here, and that actually crosses party lines. Here we tested support for the Justice 40 initiative. So this is the idea advanced by the president and his party that 40% of investments should be directed to communities on the front lines of poverty and pollution, so historically disinvested communities, communities of color. And I would say, again, as I said before, there is rising racial resentment that's finding a vehicle in the Republican Party in this country. But despite that cultural phenomenon, we actually see pretty robust support for the notion that we should be investing in ways that fight racial injustice and histories of redlining and disenfranchisement, et cetera. Now, turning to the question of climate change, which is, of course, another very partisan football, we also find that voters want the country to address climate change. So a plurality of voters agree with the statement that the United States has done too little to address climate change. This is, of course, driven heavily by Democrats, as climate change has increasingly become a very polarized issue. There's actually very interesting survey data that was released just the other day by Gallup that showed that the polarization on the issue of climate change has reached sort of a historic high. Here we tested a binary about investing in clean energy, which can create jobs, and another statement that says that investing in clean energy might raise utility bills and undermine America's energy independence, which is an argument that you obviously hear from the Republican Party very often. And in this instance, again, we saw a majority of support for the more liberal leaning statement, aside from among Republicans who have clearly sort of heard the message from their party around killing jobs, raising utility bills, and energy independence. Although, of course, those are, in our view, not real issues. Lastly, voters want the clean energy transition to protect the environment and lower utility bills. So here we gave respondents a number of options to select from about which they care about the most. So here we saw that protecting the environment and giving us a future with cleaner air and cleaner water, rises to the top. But also, people do care about their pocketbook, and as we transition to clean energy, we should be keeping in mind the potential to, protect voters and the public's savings. That clearly comes to the top in many of the surveys that we feel that data progress. Lastly, this is a fairly wonky thing that we tested, but it's actually a really important policy, perhaps one of the most important from a climate perspective, and that is the push to implement a clean electricity standard that would require utilities across the country to source 100% of their electricity from clean energy or net zero emissions sources by 2035. This is going to be, I would say, probably a very significant sort of fight in the upcoming legislative push in Congress, one where Joe Manchin is going to be a very important decision maker, and we're paying very close attention to how he positions on this question. But encouragingly, at least nationwide, we see a strong majority of Democrats, as well as a majority of independents, supporting the notion that we should be implementing a clean electricity standard. And this is, I think, an important question to watch as we sort of keep tabs on this infrastructure package moving through Congress. Real quick, I'm going to run through some data related to New York, since ANHD and this audience is probably pretty New York focused, and there are, of course, other places beyond Washington where there's opportunity to pass laws to advance these kinds of goals. In particular, I'd say the Climate Community Investment Act in New York State is a very exciting development, and one that we're paying close attention to. So New York voters specifically feel that New York is doing too little. A plurality of New York voters say that New York is doing too little to address climate change and to reduce pollution. I don't think that's a particularly surprising finding. And then we looked at a number of policies here. So Data for Progress worked with a number of other think tanks, as well as Representative Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Bernie Sanders, on a bill called a Green New Deal for Public Housing. This idea has now been picked up by a number of mayoral candidates in New York City. And we found that statewide investments in a Green New Deal for public housing would be popular, actually finding over 70% support, which is very strong. And very strong, I think we should say, despite the history, of course, of attacks against investments in public housing and disinvestment in public housing and stigmatization of social housing. just a couple more points here. New York voters also want to expand and improve public transit. I will say that I went to school in New York, lived there for a number of years, as I mentioned, and I have certainly tweeted at Governor Cuomo about the subway. So I don't think that this should be a surprising finding for anyone on this webinar. And lastly, we tested the clean electricity standard in New York State as well. Of course, last year, New York passed a similar law called the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which included a clean electricity standard, clean energy standard. We found that the 100% by 2035 target has well over 60% support among voters in the state. Let's see. Finally, this is, I think, particularly of interest to folks watching the debate over the Climate and Community Investment Act in New York State. But this is about whether polluters should be paying for the pollution that they emit, which is core to the progressive climate tax sort of fight. And here we found that nearly 70% of voters agree that polluters should be paying fines and paying for their pollution, which is, I think, a very strong finding for advocates of that law. Some final thoughts here. I think it's always important not to stretch our analysis too far. So I think it's safe to say that a progressive orientation around jobs, justice, and climate is popular. But we need to do further research, particularly in key geographies on the national political map, to understand what the best way is to talk about the American Jobs Plan in battleground states and districts and among persuadable voters. And we did not dive into that too much in this slide deck. And it's something that we're looking into moving forward. Secondly, as I mentioned at the beginning, conservative media is very powerful. And I think further research can help us identify pain points for progressives. So these are the things like those famous farting cows in the Green New Deal FAQ. Those are the kinds of things that we've seen Fox News and Republicans target in their messages against us. And I think we need to know what those are. And we're going to discover them. We're starting to discover them right now as Republicans get out their statements about the American Jobs Plan. And I think we should test the resilience of our policies and messages against those attacks. And I'm hopeful, given the success of the party and the president so far, that a progressive message can win against conservative attacks. And finally, there's a lot more to test, I would say, even beyond sort of the jobs, justice, and climate framework. For example, one element of the American Jobs Plan that we did not discuss in this slide deck is the notion that we need to outcompete China. This is a very sort of in vogue idea among DC insiders on both sides of the aisle, who believe that if we frame things as a way to win great power conflict with the People's Republic of China, we can win majorities of the electorate. I think that this idea needs to be tested more. I'm personally a little bit skeptical of it because of probably my ideological priors. But I think that this is an additional area of interest. And as I mentioned at the top as well, we included one thing here about the care economy. There's going to be a lot more on the care economy in the American Families Plan that's coming out in a couple weeks. And I think that set of questions is also very relevant and is not addressed here. I wanted to end with a meme, which would be appropriate for my generation and the amount of time that I spend on the internet, which is far too much. Over the summer, after convening a task force with surrogates from the Bernie Sanders campaign, including a number of my friends and colleagues in the progressive movement, Biden updated his climate plan in a move that, according to political historians who I talked to, was unprecedented. He actually made his plan more progressive and ambitious moving into the general election, which is, again, a historically unusual thing to do and a politically unusual thing to do. And just last week, we got the American Jobs Plan, which could be bigger in my view. I'm sure it could be bigger in Congressman Bowman's view as well. But I think that it's a pretty strong opening offer and will be a down payment on a more just, prosperous, and clean future. I'm very much looking forward to what Representative Bowman has to say, as well as the responses, and just want to thank everyone again for listening and for the invitation to share some of our preliminary research. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Julian. I'll invite you to keep your camera on for just a minute, and also for Representative Bowman and Dan and Barika also to join us on the screen as we transition a little bit. I think it's really helpful and valuable to get a sense of where people are at, and it's so important as we attempt to really take advantage of this political moment to use narrative strategies that connect with regular people and with policymakers on a core level. And so, as you referenced, Julian, there's the sort of perspectives, and there's the polling, and then there's also the politics. And so we want to think about how that national perspective plays out in the political realm, and how decisions and investments made at the national level translate to the local level. So we're really excited for this next piece of the conversation to hear from Representative Jamaal Bowman, who represents New York's 16th district. He ran on a platform of transformative progressive policies that were informed by his experience as an educator. And I understand that he's actually joining us today from his former school. So really thrilled to have you with us, Representative Bowman, and I'll turn the floor over to you to talk about the challenges and opportunities in building a green and just economic recovery for the country and for your community.
Of course, absolutely. Good afternoon, everyone. Super exciting to be back at the school that I founded, the Cornerstone Academy for Social Action. I'm actually sitting in between our two science classrooms in like a science laboratory, which I think is appropriate for our discussion today, discussing a Green New Deal and discussing what I think is a radical reimagining of the world around us. You know, when we talk about infrastructure, both hard and soft infrastructure, for my Republican colleagues who don't think things like care are a part of infrastructure, it actually is. As we think about infrastructure, as we think about community building and community development, as we think about public education, public housing, the highways that are not too far from where I'm sitting now, this is about radical dreams and a radical reimagining of our reality in the world that we live in. I mean, the bottom line is, you know, COVID has had the disproportionate impact on communities of color and historically marginalized communities, because those communities have been redlined. Those communities are the ones that suffer from the comorbidities associated with climate change and neglect. It's unfortunate that, you know, there's so many kids in the Bronx and so many kids across the country that have to live with asthma, where they literally struggle to breathe because a highway was built in the middle of their communities and split their communities in half. It's unfortunate that our kids are dealing with asbestos and lead in public housing that continues to be underfunded and neglected, and has been for decades, particularly over the last decade. It's unfortunate that buses and trains are parked in these communities where the fumes are continuing to be inhaled by our most vulnerable populations. You know, that is a 19th century, that's a 20th century way of looking at the world, a world where it's built on a caste system, a world where we have the haves and the have-nots, and the people who are determined to be the have-nots, they suffer the most. And this is not just an issue in the Bronx, this is not just an issue throughout the country, this is a global issue, where those in the global South who are struggling with poverty to begin with have to engage in mass migrations because of climate change and how climate change has impacted their lives. So this is about a 21st century industrial revolution, if you will, focused on clean, green, renewable energy. This is about reimagining a reality focused on care for oneself, care for one's family, care for community, care for environment, and care for the world. This is about investing in these communities so that they could rebuild and redesign the community in their image so that they're cleaning, breathing clean air. They are playing in green spaces. They are going to schools that have been retrofitted and redesigned and serve as interactive learning spaces where they are being taught how to solve the problems of an environment and of a world that's been too dependent on fossil fuels. It's time to abolish fossil fuels. It's time to end our dependency on fossil fuels. And just by doing that, we remake the entire world. It changes how we engage in sort of global conflict. It forces us to be more diplomatic in that engagement. It ends how we continue to invest more in our military and the construction on weapons than we invest in hospitals and people that are hurting. It forces the president and Congress to, yes, we love the paradigm shift that's happening because of all the organizing that's been going on from all of you and the great leadership of people like AOC. So we love the paradigm shift. It's happened. Wherever you go, you cannot have a conversation about a Green New Deal or clean, green, renewable energy, but we have to invest accordingly. $2 trillion is the floor and not the ceiling. Bernie Sanders' proposal of 16 trillion sounds more like it, but we may have to go bigger and beyond that because there are many problems that we are not even aware of that we have to solve. And when people hear 2 trillion or 5 trillion or 10 trillion or 16 trillion, they think about money and they think about costs and they think about how are we going to pay for it. I challenge everyone here and everyone who's going to see this video, think about this. Do we have the resources to solve the world's problems? And do we have the human capacity to solve the world's problems? And if we do, let's combine the resources with the human capacity to get us to a point of net zero carbon emissions and to build a clean, renewable world for everyone to exist in. This is about not just about environment in terms of the air quality. This is about ocean quality as well. This is about food security, and this is about agricultural justice. This is about housing and making sure our housing is clean and renewable and invested in. This is about education. This is about the entire infrastructure of the world being rebuilt as clean infrastructure, both hard infrastructure and soft infrastructure. And finally, when I talk about soft infrastructure, I'm talking about the care economy, care jobs that do not add fossil fuels or carbon to the environment, care jobs where, guess what? If we don't care for each other, we don't have the people to build the infrastructure that we need. So we have to care for each other first. We have to care for our seniors. We have to care for people with disabilities. We have to care for our students. We have to care for those who are sick in our hospitals. We have to care for our children. We have to care for our babies, because it's through care, not only do we get to our goal of net zero carbon emissions, but we get away from an economic system rooted in oppression and caste and what I call plantation capitalism. We have to get away from that because it's literally destroying us. It's literally killing us. And if it's not being killed from a severe asthma attack or heart disease or high blood pressure or hypertension, it's a global pandemic that will come along and take people out. We have, I don't even know what the number is now. It's almost 600,000 people dead from a global pandemic that could have been avoided, and we could have responded to it better if we were focused on care and collaboration and community and cooperation more than we focus on competition and the accumulation of capital. Capitalism and the accumulation of capital is literally destroying the planet and killing the human race. It's time to pivot away from that. I'm excited by what Congress is doing. I'm excited by what's coming out of the White House. I'm excited by all of you and the grassroots who have mobilized the entire nation to get us where we need to go. It's exciting to be here, but we have to make these transformative changes right now. The data shows it. Our job now is to continue to tell stories and continue to change the hearts and minds and inspire everyone to get involved, because we're going to need everyone to make the transformative change that's necessary. Thank you so much. It's a blessing to be here.
Thank you so much. I'll encourage folks to use the reactions in your Zoom screen if we want to do a virtual round of applause. I think this is the kind of vision that we need right now. And we've had many years of, when we talk about infrastructure, people think of a bridge or a road. But I think the work that's happening right now on investing in schools, investing in public housing and broadband is helping us to really see the human impact of this work and how it can deliver justice to frontline communities, including those that are in your district. So I'm looking forward to bringing in our respondents, but before we do so, want to leave some time for discussion between our two panelists. And I think something that came up that was really interesting to me in both of the presentations was the emphasis on the care economy. And Julian, you spoke about the support for introducing good unionized jobs as part of decarbonizing the economy. And, when people think of unionized workers, they're not always thinking about care workers, but actually here in New York, it's one of the most heavily organized sectors and is a really important part of the labor movement. And I know Representative Bowman, you recently introduced the Care for All resolution. So clearly there's like an important need to focus on good jobs and on making care jobs really good jobs. And I wanted to see if either of you have thoughts on really why we should be investing in care workers specifically and how that links to a broader investment, equitable investment in infrastructure.
Julian, you go first, man.
I was going to let the congressman go first. All right, I'll be the sacrificial lamb. So I think that, firstly, I think it's important to, as when we talk about the care economy, acknowledge that there is this very specific history of domestic workers in particular being excluded from the labor movement and excluded from the National Labor Relations Act, which directly comes from a history of racism and patriarchy, because historically domestic workers, and still to this day, tend to be women and people of color. And essentially the idea was that those forms of work did not deserve to be formally recognized or organized or protected by a union. And that is still a legacy that folks who are organizing on that issue and pushing for meaningful policy change are fighting against. I think that Congressman Bowman said it incredibly well when he pointed out that work in the care economy. This is, as we were saying, the folks who take care of our grandparents and our parents, the folks who provide childcare for our kids if we have kids, who provide essential health care, et cetera. Are often, and also teach our kids, are often, providing forms of labor and work that are low or no carbon, right? Yet, in sort of the traditional definitions of work and jobs, and even in the definitions of green jobs that are used by things like the Bureau of Labor Statistics that officially accounts for what is considered a green job, those forms of work are not included, right? And so there are options here where I think in the face of a broad economic transition that includes a transition to clean energy, that includes a transition towards a care economy, and that includes, and that those transitions will require, significant changes in the kinds of things that we measure and shape policies through. I think that we need to be starting to think about how we account for and gather data on these things. So that we can start recognizing, affirming, and protecting the forms of labor that will, be a real driver of the 21st century economy, of which the care economy is going to be a very central one.
Yeah, and I would just add, Julian spoke about care for our seniors, our grandparents, and our parents. I would just add care for our children and particularly children in the early childhood education space. And I'm talking birth to age 8. It's important for our children to understand as much as they can and learn as much as they can about the environment, and to understand the symbiotic relationship between them and their environment. There are some schools, for example, that make it a core part of their curriculum to take kids on nature walks. Like something as small as that packs a big punch and has a huge impact. Our curriculum, as we care for our kids throughout their time in school, has to be aligned to that symbiotic relationship. In our school, where I'm sitting right now, we were one of the only middle schools in the city to have an agriculture program in the school where our kids learned organic farming and like designed and built an organic farm where they grew organic fruits and vegetables, which is important in terms of curriculum, but it's important in terms of agriculture justice and food security and all of the things that our kids in our communities, historically marginalized communities, are dealing with. The issue of food insecurity, like lack of access to healthy foods, lack of access to organic foods, lack of affordability in terms of access to those foods. That speaks to care for the environment and children, and talks about the intersectionality of all of those things. So again, it's Republicans who are criticizing Gillibrand for saying care is infrastructure obviously don't understand that words have multiple meanings and different connotations. And as we talk about the Green New Deal and remaking the world, we have to talk about all of these things as intersectional issues, and in my opinion, under the umbrella of care.
Great. Thanks so much for those responses. I just wanted to ask one final question before we bring on our respondents. So it seems like if we did a public poll based on the Data for Progress data, we'd have the American Jobs Plan enacted tomorrow. We know that's not really how policy gets made. So I wanted to ask, especially for you, Congressman, but Julian, if you have thoughts on this as well, what are some of the real challenges that we see between the introduction and the passage of something like the American Jobs Plan? What are things that we really need to be focused on to ensure that this actually does become a plan that brings equitable investment in our key infrastructure?
Yeah, so the president introduced his plan, and again, it's a great start, but it's important for us to continue to push our elected officials and the White House to go further with the plan. And it's important for myself as a member of Congress to create an alternative response to the plan in a way that will make the plan even stronger. And it's my job to organize my colleagues inside of Congress while working with organizers outside of Congress to push to make the plan as strong as possible and to make future plans as strong as possible. So that's both in the House, on the House side, but also on the Senate side as well. We all heard Senator Manchin sort of come out and say what he had to say. But what I've learned is leverage and pressure does lead to results. And the more, I'm actually happy that Senator Manchin sort of drew his line in the sand. So now we know, who we need to go at and how we need to go at them to force them to hopefully encourage them to move on this issue. So it's not, what the president proposed is not a done deal. We can make it stronger. We can push to make it stronger. And that's sort of why they do these things. They put it out there to see how the public is going to respond. So let's respond accordingly, both myself as a member of Congress and the movement, so that we can make the plan stronger. And again, future plans going forward need to all be aligned to the new vision we have for our country.
Yeah, I'd just like to add on to what the congressman just said. Of course, our system is one where, very specific senators and districts, and often actually very specific constituencies within those states and districts have disproportionate say over the laws that pass, particularly in a 50-50 Senate where any senator could theoretically be the tying vote or the passing vote. But where, of course, our 50th vote in this instance is likely a Democrat in a coal state that tends to vote Republican, except for when it votes for Manchin. who feels very strongly that, he wants to push for bipartisanship and put some brakes on some of the things that the progressive wing of the party needs to do. I think that here it's really important to keep in mind that persuasion is, I think, a really important tool. So, I come from an organizing activist background. I was part of the group of folks who were pushing for Secretary Holland to be the first Native American cabinet secretary, for example. And that at the same time as we, put pressure on lawmakers from the outside, using protest, using actions, et cetera, using our leverage, I think it's also really important to keep in mind that there are real intellectual arguments. There are real arguments that require evidence, that require research, that can be won here. Very clearly, there has been a debate in the field of economics, for example, and broader policymaking circles over the last 10 years about the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, where the consensus has been reached that it was too small. And we can now see that Obama's vice president, Joe Biden, is responding to the debate and to that research and investing more in the economy than former economic advisors like Larry Summers would want him to. And I think that we need to remember that it's actually very possible for progressives, for researchers who are aligned with them, and for the folks who are engaged in in politics and a democracy to win these arguments, because the arguments do matter, and winning the arguments, I think, is really key to our success.
Thank you so much, Julian. And thanks so much, Representative Bowman. Let's please have another round of applause for our amazing speakers. There's just such a wealth of really incredible knowledge, both about the mechanics of the investment that we need to do, the politics, the vision that we have for transformation at the national level. And it's just so critical at this moment that we have people both inside and outside of government who are focusing on transformative investments in our infrastructure and in our economy. So is incredibly valuable. We're going to welcome on our local respondents, Jainey Bavishi from the New York City Mayor's Office of Resiliency and Michael Partis of the Bronx Cooperative Development Initiative. And we're going to hear from them what some of these politics and investments may look like on the local level. And then we're happy to bring all of our speakers back together for some moderated discussion. And I know some folks have been submitting questions in the Q&A. We'll be happy to get to those when we bring the moderated discussion back together. So thanks so much for joining us. I think, Jainey, we're going to start off with you and really want to hear how you're incorporating resiliency into work at the local level and how that work can be used in the service of equitable investment, how are policymakers connecting with sort of the design and planning world in order to really implement these investments on the local level.
Great, thanks so much, Karen, and thanks NHD and UDF for putting on this inspiring conversation. It's really an honor to be a part of it. Julian and I have been in a couple of events recently, and Julian, I always learn something from you, so thank you for your insights, and Congressman Bowman, thank you for your inspiring leadership on these issues. I want to start by just making kind of an overarching statement, which is that it is imperative that we think about climate adaptation as an essential form of climate action. And we need to do that in parallel with urgently decarbonizing our economy. But we must recognize that there are impacts of climate change that we are feeling right now. We're coming off of the most active Atlantic hurricane season on record. We're coming off of the second hottest year on record, and that's only 1/100 of a degree cooler than the hottest year on record. And we are going to continue to feel impacts of climate change that we cannot avoid. And so we have to think about climate adaptation as an essential and imperative form of climate action. And we must do it because it's a climate justice issue. If we do not approach climate adaptation intentionally and equitably, we will only replay and perpetuate the systemic inequities that we see in a whole host of other policy areas in our country. So the recovery from COVID and this infrastructure plan, the American Jobs Act, really offers us a unique opportunity to simultaneously tackle climate vulnerabilities and address historic inequities. And I want to just take through a couple of things that we're doing here in New York City locally to prepare for this opportunity and to show leadership in this area. First, just a couple of weeks ago, our city council passed legislation that will mandate that we account for climate impacts, that we account for the climate change in all of our $90 billion capital portfolio. This means that we will account for rising seas, for storm surge, for extreme heat, for intense precipitation in every buildings and infrastructure project that New York City builds. Every school, every bridge, every road will account for climate impacts. This is really an enormous accomplishment, and it means that we will be positioned as federal infrastructure dollars flow to the city to take leadership in this space. We will make sure that we're building not with historic data, not with the weather that we experienced yesterday or 10 years ago, but rather the weather that we're going to experience in the future. And it also is important because it takes climate resilience and climate adaptation projects out of a silo, and it starts embedding a climate resilience lens into all city actions, decisions, and investments. And we have much more to do on this space, but it's a really important milestone in our work in this area. And as we think about buildings, facilities, infrastructure, and as an extension of the conversation about the care economy, we're also thinking about social infrastructure in particular. Again, libraries, schools, community centers, senior centers, these are all places that our communities rely on and are places that they gather, especially when there's a crisis, especially when there's a heat wave or when there's a storm event. We want to make sure that these facilities are prepared to serve as those hubs, as those places that our communities can go to in those crisis moments. And so we're taking a particular emphasis and a particular focus on social infrastructure facilities as we think about the need to upgrade our buildings all across the city going forward. We know that we have to really focus on our built environment, our infrastructure, and our buildings, and make them resilient so that we are building resilient systems and not putting the burden of being resilient on our communities and our residents. But with that said, we know that there are also steps that residents can take. And in particular, we really believe that the basic tenet of neighbors helping neighbors is an incredible principle to weave through all of our resiliency portfolio. So we're focused on social cohesion and trying to cultivate this idea of neighbors helping neighbors really intentionally. We actually launched a program called Be a Buddy as part of our extreme heat resiliency strategy in the city a couple of years ago. It's a program that pairs up vulnerable residents with volunteers to make sure that the volunteers are checking in on seniors, on the chronically disabled, on the most vulnerable members of our communities during extremely hot days, making sure that they're staying hydrated, staying safe, turning on their AC to 78 degrees because it's a way to stay cool and safe without driving up your energy bills. But we realized that we actually activated our Be a Buddy networks more during COVID than any other time. It really goes to show that the steps we're taking to make sure that we're staying safe and being resilient to the impacts of climate change are also steps that can help protect our communities from a whole host of other shocks and stresses. So we want to continue this program and continue to expand it. And then lastly, this graphic that you see here on the slide is a graphic of our heat vulnerability index. This is a map that we use to account for not only the physical indicators of heat risk, but also the social indicators of heat risk. So things like density and lack of vegetation on the physical side, but also things like race and poverty on the social side, because we know that ultimately vulnerability to heat, extreme heat, is not just an accumulation of physical factors. Social factors also matter. So we've overlaid all those factors into this heat vulnerability index. And this is the index that we use to really drive our investments in heat resiliency. We know that certain communities, that low-income communities of color are the communities that are disproportionately impacted by climate change. And we want to make sure that we are driving our resiliency investments to those same communities so that they are also experiencing the benefits, the environmental benefits of our adaptation and resiliency investments. So the areas in red here are the areas that we're really focused on, Central Brooklyn, Northern Manhattan, South Bronx. And we're also working to create similar tools that take physical and social indicators of risk into account for the other hazards we face, including coastal storms. So I'll stop there. I know I have limited time, but I really look forward to the conversation later in the program.
Great, thank you so much, Jainey. And that map is just so striking. I think it's really, you know, we often think about infrastructure, like I said earlier, as like the ways that we get to where we're going. But the question is like, what is there when we get there? And I think looking at, you know, looking at the ways that our neighborhoods are impacted by climate change, are really similar to the ways that they're impacted by poverty and the results of other types of disinvestment. And it's really helpful to be able to see this represented and to hear about the work that that you all are doing and ways to incorporate that. So now, Michael, I'm going to turn it over to you. And I think, you know, we want to hear how what the politics of recovery look like in the Bronx right now, and what you and others at BCDI are thinking as you sort of process the opportunities for recovery, some of the challenges that the other speakers have mentioned. What is that looking like for you all?
Thank you, Karen. A lot of Bronx pride today. Great to have the congressman with us and for this incredible discussion. So we want to bring it local for a moment. And at the Bronx Cooperative Development Initiative, one of the important premise for the work is that ending racial inequality is an economic development strategy, right? And for us, it really begins with a radical imagination, as we talked about previously. And that radical imagination began with, what if the community owned it, as you can see on the right-hand side? What if we owned it? What if we planned it? What if we designed it? What would community governance look like? What would it make our economy look like? How would it model transformation? And ultimately, and specifically, right, how will it create an equitable, sustainable, and democratic local economy that creates wealth and ownership for low-income people of color? And so for us, that approach is framed in economic democracy. In economic democracy, one of the premise that BCDI and the framework holds is that Bronx communities, the organizers, those are the architects of the economic and political systems that we need in order to truly represent democratic governance and shared power. That the folks on the ground, and specifically in BIPOC and working class communities, that those folks not only model cooperation, which will be important for our future, but also that they represent knowledge, wisdom, and assets that in their social and economic makeup, the genius and brilliance for transformation and for justice exist. And so economic democracy frames that around a racial justice strategy, a deeply democratic approach in order to not only create shared wealth, but also to come across into more justice. And so community wealth really begins on the predistributive side. And for us, that means how can we, in a multi-stakeholder coalition, how can we begin to look at economic development differently? And how can we begin to embed community wealth strategies? And particularly here, when we talk about community wealth strategies, I'll highlight in a moment, worker cooperatives and social enterprises, along with CBOs, groups who are enterprising on the ground. What we're going to talk about is many in our community, they haven't been waiting for, sustainability or resilience to become popular. It's been a movement on the ground that they've been prototyping and scaling and learning by doing because of necessity. And so for us, the economic democracy model not only talks about participatory, deeply democratic process, but it also focuses on control and ownership of the economy by BIPOC populations. What does that look like on the ground? So our Bronx community has been linking sustainability and wellness as economic development approaches. And one representation of that is our Bronx People's Platform and Plan. To date, we've had 24 organizations and growing come together to create a 2021 Bronx People's Platform, rooted in racial and economic justice. And what you see on the slide in front of you are some of the leadership coalition that's been cooperatively working together to build what we call the civic infrastructure for the sustainable, people-driven economic development process. And we have to give a shout out to Bronx Bethany Church of the Nazarene up in the Northeast Bronx, just a few blocks away from Congressman Bowman's former school that he founded. One important thing around how communities are being radical, but tying their history into that, economic democracy looks to build community power, and it looks to build community power in organizations, not only individuals. This is a key thing to highlight here, because specifically by building our organizations to be strong, by connecting folks to the work that's already happening on the ground, we eliminate the belief that there's deep deficits in our community, right? We begin to have people recognize that there are assets in planning, designing, thinking, strategizing, and that there are people doing work on the ground already. What is that work? Our values really focus on systemic level change, racial justice, intergenerational lenses, gender justice, and critical for today's conversation, environmental and ecological justice. Some of the things in our platform, particularly for this conversation, you could look at in the economy, investing in redline and marginalized communities. And one way that we could do that is through supporting community and cooperative finance. Another way is invest in cooperative projects and institutions that build more economic democracy. What you see in this platform is how these organizations across the Bronx have come together to say, this is the platform that we want. This is the agenda that's important to us. And it begins with, in a simple step on the economic side, a radical systems change to prioritize redlined and marginalized communities, and even further to invest in cooperative models, both with finance as well as in the democratic dimension. A second point here revolves around our work on environment and energy. The platform calls for 20 million investment in developing regional economic development plans and strategies. Specifically, you see in energy and sustainable systems. We're calling for investment in microgrids and community-owned solar, all local Green New Deal legislation, converting public transportation to renewable energy, and LEED conversions. And so at a local level, these groups across the Bronx have identified the very same policies that we are now lifting up at a national level, but they're doing it by the experiences that they've had on the ground. They've done it by the prototypes that they've created, by the businesses that they interact with. As you see here, housing and sanctuary cities are important aspects of this. And for a moment, it's important to recognize that a number of our partners in the South Bronx have been coming together to do this work, to push back on harmful land use policy, building important community governance projects in Wi-Fi, solar energy, foodways. And so a shout out to our partners, the Point CDC, Mothers on the Move, Youth Ministries Peace and Justice, and the work of the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance. For those of you interested, not just in this platform, but in that work, we strongly encourage in our model that you connect to these organizations to learn more about particularly what's happening on the ground. And for folks who want to join and learn more about the movement, you can come to our planning assembly kickoff that we're having tomorrow, and I could drop a link in the chat. To close out, we want to specifically talk about community wealth building and how we're seeing it in enterprise and very specifically worker cooperatives. So our partners in the South Bronx in the worker cooperative community have been demonstrating the power of shared leadership and democratic economic models specifically for climate and environmental justice. One example here you'll see is an integrated pest management. Integrated pest management is critical for our environmental health. And on the right side, you see a business, Skedaddle. Skedaddle is a worker-owned cooperative, majority Black worker owners who have been coming together not only for the social factor, right, of a better environment, but also as a business model creating wealth. You also see on the right hand side here, Kojo Pest Management, Cultural pest management has been working to reduce the social determinants of health in our neighborhoods. And one of the important things that they've done is they've been able to connect to long-term care providers to be able to enhance the quality of integrated pest management in their communities. So these are local folks who live in the Bronx, who own businesses, but do it in a worker cooperative or enterprising way, but are deeply committed to the environment. And as we think about national legislation, it's important for us to have these folks in mind and make sure that they're not left behind. The other examples quickly, BioClassic, all Latina worker cooperative in the Bronx. They've done incredible work in cleaning and sanitation. And one of the key components as we think about this group is how do we ensure that our folks on the front line are safe as we begin this work, as we continue this work rather in environmental justice, in sustainability and resilience. We know that cleaning is deeply important, but it's equally important that our folks, our essential folks who are on the ground doing that work, overwhelmingly BIPOC, right? How do we protect them? So not only is the work important for our health and our safety as we think about reopening in the various ways, as we adjust to what normal will be like to ensure safety, we also need to consider how our workers on the front line, like BioClassic, how do we protect them? How do we make sure that they're essential, but not just essential, but that they're protected? As well as the community wealth strategies. How do we continue to not have a deficit model, but look at these businesses that are available, working, and need support from the community? Lastly, as an example of how the sustainability movement is happening in the Bronx, David Lee of KD Knit. David Lee is an advanced manufacturer, works in fashion, and has decided to bring his sustainable technology into the Bronx. And David will be opening a small factory in our South Bronx in a recently redeveloped area of the neighborhood. David Lee decided to come back to the Bronx because of the assets that it has in its neighborhoods and communities, because of the people and workforce. Not only is David bringing jobs back, which we heard scores very highly in the priorities of folks, but David is bringing it back with a fundamental focus on environment and sustainability. And you can see here in front of you how David and KD Knit, his company, is bringing new fabrics that are more safe, fabrics that are more just, fabrics that are more just and equitable for the environment. And so on the ground in the Bronx, whether you're seeing communities respond to their needs and show us the model for what legislation should focus on, what legislation should invest in. And as we look at these businesses who are showing how worker cooperatives and how community wealth not only can be out for poverty, but also as reflecting assets. Economic democracy reflects this. The coordinating and cooperative capacity that it takes is something our organization and all of our partners not only focus on, but feel is important. And as we begin to think about and continue to move for the green economy, we want to remember the folks who have been building that model before it was popular. And we want to remain that economic justice and economic democracy foremost is a way forward. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Michael. It's really, well, first of all, it's exciting for me as an organizer when someone gives a presentation and they give folks a way that they can plug in, come to our event, get involved. I think that's so important, and it makes me happy to see that, for us as a membership organization. And the other thing that I would say is it is, I think, not a coincidence that we have a lot of Bronx folks on this call. I think the Bronx is one of the parts of New York City that has seen the most disinvestment and the most sort of inequitable infrastructure policies, but it's also one of the places where a lot of really innovative and exciting ideas are coming from. And a lot of what we sort of have been used to over the last few decades is a really reactive negative politics around investment, where people are assuming that investment is going to cause displacement and it's going to have a negative impact on their lives. And in many cases that has been true. And what I'm excited about and what I want to talk with our speakers about is how we can shift to sort of a more positive vision where we're aiming infrastructure investment at the communities that need it most. And we're those communities are actually directing that investment, so that we assume that big transformative visions and projects are actually a good thing that are going to uplift our communities. So I sort of wish we could be on here all day. We have about 15 minutes left for discussion. And what I'm going to do is put out some questions that folks can respond to. I'd also encourage the speakers to respond to each other if you want to unmute and share thoughts. Unfortunately, Representative Bowman had to leave, but we've still got Julian, Jainey, and Michael with us. So I'll just kick it off with a question. And Jainey, I'll put it to you to answer first, but would love to hear everyone's responses. So one key element of the original New Deal in New York City was the city's incredible use of federal resources. There was not only an enormous investment at the federal level, but people at the city level really mobilized to take advantage of that. And so I wanted to hear more about how the city's current resiliency efforts, as well as efforts to invest in things like economic democracy and retrofits, can draw on programs like the American Jobs Act. And what do we need to really make sure that those federal investments are reaching our local communities?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Karen. You know, I think that there's, especially in the in this era that we were just coming out of, the Trump era, we heard a lot about the importance of cities and states taking leadership. And I think absolutely we saw a lot of action at the local and state level, and it was really important to keep the work going and keep the momentum going. But it doesn't abdicate the federal government of its responsibility, right? The federal government plays a really incredibly important role, and especially in terms of resourcing this work. So we need to continue to think about creative financing strategies going forward. Adaptation and resiliency in particular are really expensive, and we need to think about how we can, better finance avoided cost, avoided loss, so that we're able to attract kind of diverse sources of funding to that work. But right now we're in a situation where most of the dollars for adaptation and resiliency in particular flow after a disaster. And that's an incredibly reactive approach to a problem that we need to take proactive action on. So the American Jobs Act is just such an incredible potential that's out there, because it could really, if it's done right, and if it really accounts for resilience and climate across every investment that could potentially be made, then it could really kind of supercharge this work across the country and make dollars flow that otherwise cities and states don't really have access to.
Michael or Julian, other thoughts on that?
Just on the financing point that Jainey made, and firstly, I'd say that the maps also that she showed were awesome. And one of the main problems that we face at the national level is that there's this tool called the Environmental Justice Screen, EJ Screen, that the EPA uses, that was disinvested in during the Trump years, and is actually really bad at mapping cumulative impacts of environmental injustice. And we really need, it's also really bad at getting sort of consistent data across states. And so we really need to update that tool so that policymakers actually can get the information they need to target investments and other policy interventions in ways that are just and equitable nationally. And I think that what New York is doing, as well as what states like California are doing with the Cal Enviro Screen 4.0, are really great models that could be learned from. And then on the finance point, I'm of the sort of wing of the progressive movement that believes in public options for many things. And I think one area where the public option has been underexplored is the area of finance. So the American Jobs Plan included Clean Energy and Sustainability Accelerator, which could also be called a green bank or an infrastructure bank. So this would be a federal institution that would lend into the economy. I think that's a great start. It's capitalized at $27 billion. Bills in Congress have similar institutions capitalized at 4 times that amount, so $100 billion. And I think that we also need to start thinking about other forms of finance that the public sector should be engaged in beyond just extending credit. And here, I'm really proud of some of the work that Data for Progress has been helping to put into the world with Cornell Law School professor named Saleh Omarova. around an idea that's called the National Investment Authority, which is essentially the combination of an infrastructure bank, so a public lender, with an asset manager. So this is a new idea that the federal government should be taking an equity stake in the economy, an active equity stake, in a manner similar to models that are used in China, as well as some parts of the European economy, where to invest in some of these riskier but essential long-term investments in adaptation, in decarbonization, making things like the potential for carbon removal technologies to become utilities 50 years in the future, would be really, really essential. And I'm really excited that there's a potential for the Congressional Progressive Caucus to actually pick up this idea and advocate for it in the American Jobs Plan, which would just make my heart sing. So.
On the finance piece, I think the quick things I would say is at the state level in New York, we have a coalition on public banking, fighting for that legislation. I think the second thing is, at the federal level, we've seen this investing in CDFIs, and specifically CDFIs that are BPOC led, can have an incredible effect at the local level. And I think third, one of these strategies too, as well as when this legislation begins to be rolled out and the contracting and the opportunities will be available, how do we procure, right? Which may not seem quite like a finance question here, but it is absolutely a community wealth kind of question. And so the money that is coming out of public policy, how do we make sure that it is connected to folks on the ground, which then becomes what is our equitable procurement kind of questions and policies and procedures. So I would offer those three things.
Great, thanks so much. I mean, I think this is sort of an indication of how interconnected these investments are with other pieces of our economy. When we're not just talking about like creating sort of these green pilot programs, this is really about major changes in the way our economy works, from the way people access credit to the way we make investments to sort of who has ownership of our economy, Michael, as you were saying. So I think all of that is really important. And the next question, I'm going to sort of initially put it to you, Julian, and then kind of get a response from Jainey and Michael. But we've got sort of two different layers happening here. We've got the national layer and the local layer. And how are you all at Data for Progress and other national climate activists, when you're creating plans like the Green New Deal for public housing or other initiatives, like what's the sort of information and inputs that are really valuable for you all from folks who are working on the ground? And then also thinking, Michael and Jainey, what are the conversations that either need to happen more or that aren't happening between the local and the national level? I think there's such a difference in scale. There's really a difference in what people are focused on. And so where can we make those linkages and really make sure that people are talking to each other and kind of making sure that national investments are getting effectively implemented on the ground?
Yeah, so I think that I come from the sort of school of policy thought that says that states and local jurisdictions and tribes, we often forget tribes, so we should include tribes, are in many ways sort of laboratories for democracy. And I think that a lot of the ideas that can be pursued in particularly progressive jurisdictions, so places like New York City, I'm from the Bay Area, as well as states that are governed by more enlightened legislatures, can and often do inform the kinds of policies that get pursued then on the national level. So I just mentioned mapping and gathering data about environmental injustice, and I think this is an area where the federal government can learn a lot from state and local actors. Similarly, I think that very often the problems as well as the vision to tackle them, particularly in sort of the progressive way the Democratic Party is driven by grassroots activism. At the end of the day, the Green New Deal for Public Housing Act that we had the privilege of working on with a number of other policy wonks and Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Sanders was, responding to decades of activism focused on housing justice and focused on, what dignified right to housing should look like in our society. And I think that those connections, sort of the relationship between activism and organizing on the one hand, and policy and technical expertise on the other, are really just fundamental to any sort of notion of progressive and good governance. And when those two things are working together, I think that we have the best chance of advancing policies that can really meaningfully change and transform people's circumstances for the better.
What I would offer, building on the governance piece, is in terms of how we can learn from what's happening locally. There's a tremendous amount of shared leadership and participatory planning and people-led planning happening throughout the country. Action St. Louis just recently had some success. UGMA in Boston. Of course, the citywide worker cooperative network in New York City has a policy platform. Of course, you come to the Bronx, people's assemblies are happening. So I think there's many qualitative actually data being produced, visions being produced. And I think the challenge for policymakers and wonks like us who like our neat, maps and decks, and is how do we engage with the iterative process? How do we engage where people are at? And it's not to say that our folks across the country who are doing similar work have any deficits in that kind of way, but it is to say to meet them and where their imagination, experience, and how their lived data is actually being embodied and happening, bridging that gap, because there's many groups on the ground now. That's the nuance. That's the next level of analysis and facilitation that will allow us to have more comprehensive policy.
Yeah, I agree with both what Julian and Michael have said. And, I think in the space that I work in climate adaptation and resiliency, all the work is local. It ultimately ends up being incredibly local. And it like even in New York City, our adaptation strategies have to be as diverse as our waterfront neighborhoods, because every community requires a different approach that works for both the physical characteristics of that neighborhood, but also what works for the people that live there. And so, I think, I'll be honest, I worked in the federal government in the Obama administration and on these issues, and we had made some great headway. And then I came to New York City and I learned a lot about the limitations of some of the things that we had done at the federal level. So I think that sort of constant dialogue between federal leaders and other levels of government are really important. That constant dialogue is really important. And I also would just say that we've got to act urgently. We don't have time to reinvent the wheel. So let's not all make the same mistakes. Let's just make sure that we're learning from each other, both in terms of what's working, but also what's not, so that we can move ahead as quickly as possible.
I'd just like to add one more thing, actually. I think that wonks and think tank people should think about our work the way that organizers think about their work. So I think that wonks and think tanks are actually, when they're functioning properly, organizing particular constituency that we often don't think of as needing to be organized. In this instance, it's researchers and policymakers and sort of the influential people in those circles, journalists, et cetera, who need to also be organized into projects for progressive policy change. And in that instance, I think that there's a lot of wonks and policy people who can learn a lot from the kind of work that organizers do every day.
Great. Well, I think on that note, the note of urgency and organizing, I think I'm gonna encourage everyone again to really thank our speakers. I'll bring back on Dan and Barika for a few final words, but it's been so great to be in conversation with you guys today. As I said earlier, I wish we could do this all afternoon, but there's so much important work to be done, and really want to thank all of you for your time and wisdom.
Yeah, thank you, Karen. Thank you, Karen, for moderating such a wonderful conversation. And thank you to Julian, to Jainey, Michael, Representative Bowman, who had to leave us. But it's an incredibly inspiring set of priorities that you guys have laid out there. And I'm hoping that we actually get to see them enacted in this next plan. So thank you all so much for joining us today. And thank you, of course, to our supporters, to City Community Investing in Development, as well as our members and supporters who helped to make this series possible. So I hope you'll join us for the final event of our series, Organizing Futures, which is going to be about the future of community organizing after the pandemic, which is coming up in just a few weeks. And of course, I hope you'll share with us all of your thoughts about how we might build power after the pandemic on social media and through our membership networks. So thank you.
And I just want to echo what Dan said. Thank you to all the speakers. Thank you to the congressman. We understand. We know sometimes they get pulled and have to run, but appreciate all of you all taking the time out to speak with us, our audience and our community. We had elected officials and community members and tenant leaders and everything on here. So it's always great to bring this group of people into conversation. And I think to some of what Julian just said in the closing comments is we have to really we have to think like organizers and strategize across our different areas. And part of what ANHD and UDF have been coming together to do is really bring some of those conversations together so that we're not just talking about these really important central issues that are going to shape and influence our communities and impact our ability to really change into a very different equitable recovery framework. And so we don't want to be doing those in silos. Let's figure out a way to do them together. So thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful day, and hopefully we'll see you for the next conversation.